Thank you so much to all of you for coming. I can't see you, but I can feel you. It's a little bit speaking into a void, but I know that so many people coast to coast are joining us tonight. And it's definitely a silver lining of this really strange time to be able to include people unlimited by geographic location. I'd like to give a special shout out to my 102-year-old grandfather who has mastered the technology to join us tonight. So I'm very especially honored to have him here. To help me celebrate the launch of the paperback of The Need coming out on July 7th. Thank you to all of you who are here tonight, and to all of the support that you have given to me over the course of my life and to The Need over the course of the past year. There are so many people who I love who have been a big part of my life here tonight. So thank you to all of you, and to all of you for tuning in tonight. I also want to thank Melanie, who has done a spectacular job coordinating this and getting us on this platform, and to the Center for Fiction, and for beginning with a moment of silence for Black Lives Matter. I appreciate all that the Center for Fiction does for our culture. And most of all, in my thanks, I want to celebrate this opportunity to publicly acknowledge Sarah Allen, who played such an important role in the creation of this book, who was such an incredible 24-hour paleobotany hotline for me, as everybody needs one, as I was working on the book, and who gave her time and expertise to me at a time when this book was just a file on my computer that may or may not have been going anywhere. So Sarah, thank you so much. I get to say it publicly for the first time, so I'm really happy to do that.
Thanks, Helen. It was really great to work on this project with you.
Good. I'm excited to delve more into it. And as Melanie said, this event has been a really long time in the making. It was over a year ago that Melanie mentioned that the Center for Fiction was interested in doing events that were interdisciplinary, and that I brought up to Sarah the idea of doing an event where we shared something about our work on our collaboration on this. So I'll say a few words about that. It's amazing to me now to think that I wrote an entire draft of The Need, and Molly, the protagonist, was not a paleobotanist in that draft. She had she did have a profession where she was excavating the earth, but she wasn't a paleobotanist. And now the paleobotany is so central to the book and so critical to the book. So I almost can't believe it that I had written an entire draft where I didn't know what her profession was.
Looks like Helen dropped out. We'll see if we can get her back up here. Hang on.
Am I back?
You are, yes.
I'm back, okay. Okay, I'm back. Hello, everyone. I don't know what happened. We'll just have some quirks in this experience. But I was saying that the fact that I didn't know what her profession was for an entire draft of the book, I think illuminates how much writing a novel is like walking into a forest in the dark. And I'm currently at that stage with my next book where there's so much that I don't know about the world and the situation and the scenario and the characters. And as I've been in the chaos of that and kind of the anxiety of not knowing much, it really comforts me to think back to the draft I wrote of The Need, where she wasn't even a paleobotanist, and to just trust that over time I will figure out all of these things that are such huge looming questions. And Sarah and I were writing back and forth about this yesterday, and she said, she too had forgotten that I had written an entire draft where she wasn't even a paleobotanist. And Sarah made a comparison to science, that a lot of times you'll have one theory and you'll go far down a path with that theory, and then you'll realize you have to have a total paradigm shift. So I thought it was really interesting that she said that. So before Sarah and I started talking, which we can talk a little bit about how we ended up connecting, but I knew that Molly had a job that involved excavating the earth. And I knew that strange artifacts had begun to emerge from that excavation site. But I was having a really hard time figuring out exactly what her professional life was, exactly how it tied into the elements of the plot. And so then, almost by chance, Sarah and I started talking because my in-laws know her mother. And her mother, I sort of heard, oh, she's a paleobotanist, which honestly, Sarah, I'm not positive I could have defined what that is, which is the study of plant fossils. But I thought, oh, that sounds like someone who digs in the earth a lot. I better talk to that person. Really not knowing what would come of it. And we got on the phone and I had a bunch of questions about paleobotany and about what it's like to be at a dig site or at a quarry, as Sarah would say. And over the course of that conversation, Sarah said in particular one thing to me that was extremely revelatory and enabled my whole plot to fall into place. So we'll talk more about that later. But over the course of the subsequent year, Sarah and I had numerous conversations, and all of this culminated in this exciting moment where for about a week, The Need was the best seller on Amazon in the category of paleontology. So I don't know how much competition there was, but that was an exciting moment. Bestseller in paleontology. So the run of show that Sarah and I have discussed is I will read the first chapter of The Need just to orient you all in the book, for those of you who may not have read it. And even I guess for those of you who have, there's a brief mention of her profession, not much, but you can be on the lookout for a brief mention of her profession. And then Sarah has made a really interesting PowerPoint about paleobotany and The Need. And then we'll do a recap of some of the questions that I asked her in our first conversation, and then we'll do Q&A. So that's our run of show. So I will begin by reading the first chapter of The Need. Oh, okay, I'll make eye contact. Thank you, Cheryl, for letting me know. Okay. I have never done a virtual event before, so any pointers that anyone has, put them in the comments, and I will respond in kind. But I do have to now look at the page of the book, so here goes. The first chapter of The Need. Thanks. Okay. She crouched in front of the mirror in the dark, clinging to them. The baby in her right arm, the child in her left. There were footsteps in the other room. She had heard them an instant ago. She had switched off the light, scooped up her son, pulled her daughter across the bedroom to hide in the far corner. She had heard footsteps. But she was sometimes hearing things, a passing ambulance mistaken for Ben's nighttime wail, the moaning hinges of the bathroom cabinet mistaken for Viv's impatient pre-tantrum sigh. Her heart and blood were loud. She needed them to not be so loud. Another step. Or was it a soft hiccup from Ben? Or was it her own knee joint cracking beneath 36 pounds of Viv? She guessed the intruder was in the middle of the living room now, halfway to the bedroom. She knew there was no intruder. Viv smiled at her in the feeble light of the far street lamp. Viv always craved games that were slightly frightening. Any second now, she would demand the next move in this wondrous new one. Her desperation for her children's silence manifested as a suffocating force, the desire for a pillow, a pair of thick socks, anything she could shove into them to perfect their muteness and save their lives. Another step, hesitant but undeniable. Or maybe not. Ben was drowsy, tranquil, his thumb in his mouth. Viv was looking at her with curious, cunning eyes. David was on a plane somewhere over another continent. The babysitter had marched off to get a Friday night beer with her girls. Could she squeeze the children under the bed and go out to confront the intruder on her own? Could she press them into the closet, keep them safe among her shoes? Her phone was in the other room in her bag, dropped and forgotten by the front door when she arrived home from work 25 minutes ago to a blueberry-stained Ben, to Viv parading through the living room chanting, "Birthday, birthday," with an uncapped purple marker held aloft in her right hand like the Statue of Liberty's torch. "Viv," she had roared when the marker grazed the white wall of the hallway as her daughter ran toward her. But to no avail, a purple scar to join the others, the green crayon, the red pencil. A Friday night beer with my girls. How exotic, she had thought distantly, handing over the wad of cash. Erica was 23 and buoyant and brave. She had wanted, above all else, someone brave to look after the children. "Now what?" Viv said, starting to strain against her arm. Thankfully, a stage whisper rather than a shriek. But even so, the footsteps shifted direction toward the bedroom. If David were home in the basement practicing, she would be stomping their code on the floor 5 times for "come up right this second," usually because both kids needed everything from her at once. A step? A step? This problem of hers had begun about 4 years ago, soon after Viv's birth. She confessed it only to David, wanting to know if he ever experienced the same sensation, trying and failing to capture it in words. The minor disorientations that sometimes plagued her, the small errors of eyes and ears. The conviction that the rumble underfoot was due to an earthquake rather than a garbage truck. The conviction that there was something somehow off about a piece of litter found amid the fossils in the pit at work. A brief flash or dizziness that, for a millisecond, caused reality to shimmer or waver or disintegrate slightly. In those instants, her best recourse was to steady her body against something solid, David if he happened to be nearby, or a table, a tree, or the dirt wall of the pit, until the world resettled into known patterns and she could once more move invincible, unshakable through her day. "Yes," David said whenever she brought it up. He knew what she meant, kind of. His diagnosis, sleep deprivation and/or dehydration. Viv squirmed out of her grasp. She was a slippery kid, and with only one arm free, there was no way Molly could prevent her daughter's escape. "Stay right here," she mouthed with all the intensity she could infuse into a voiceless command. But Viv tiptoed theatrically toward the bedroom door, which was open just a crack, and grinned back at her mother, the grin turned grimace by the eerie light of the street lamp. Molly didn't know whether to move or stay put. Any quick action, a hurl across the room, a seizure of the t-shirt, was sure to unleash a scream or a laugh from Viv, was sure to disrupt Ben, lulled nearly to sleep by the panicked bouncing of Molly's arm. Viv pulled the door open. Molly had never before noticed that the bedroom door squeaked, a sound that now seemed intolerably loud. It would be so funny to tell David about this when he landed. I turned off the light and made the kids hide in the corner of the bedroom. I was totally petrified, and it was nothing. Beneath the hilarity would lie her secret concern about this little problem of hers. But their laughter would neutralize it, almost. She listened hard for the footsteps. There were none. She stood up. She raised Ben's limp, snoozing body to her chest. She flicked the light back on. The room looked warm, orderly. The gray quilt tucked tight at the corners. She would make mac and cheese. She would thaw some peas. She stepped toward the doorway where Viv stood still, peering out. "Who's that guy?" Viv said. That's the end of chapter 1. So, little cliffhanger. So I will turn it over to Sarah to explain to us what paleobotany is.
All right. Well, I'm going to share a screen with you all. And all right. Can you see that, Helen?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, perfect.
Hopefully everyone can too.
All right. Well, first I want to thank Helen for this opportunity. It's been really great to work with you on this project and exciting to see a paleobotanist, especially a female paleobotanist, featured in a work of fiction. I also want to thank Melanie and the Center for Fiction for hosting this event. It's been really exciting to work on this. And also thank many of my friends and family. I know some of them are logged in today. Many folks who've shaped my paleobotanical career, and my colleagues at Penn State Altoona. So with that, I'm going to get into what the field of paleobotany is in a moment. But first, I want to keep you in suspense, like the book, hopefully like that first chapter cliffhanger there. And I want to detour briefly to a bit about plants. So here is the cover of the book. I believe this is the paperback cover. And I want to kind of hone in your attention to the green part of our surroundings. These are frequently overlooked and ignored, and this phenomenon has been termed plant blindness. So I just want to take a moment to help you become plant aware and take some time to observe plants in your surroundings. So first off, plants are alive. Movement is not required to be alive. And in my opinion, one of the coolest features about plants is that they make their own food. They're able to use water, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and energy in sunlight to make sugars and also a byproduct of oxygen. So this is the process of photosynthesis. The carbon in sugars, which ultimately makes up most of the mass of a plant, is sourced from carbon dioxide, a gas in our atmosphere. So let that sink in for a moment. Wood, for example, is comprised of carbon atoms that were once in our atmosphere. It's pretty hard to kind of wrap your head around the first time you hear it. And also, plants, whether they're indoor, outdoor, can increase oxygen levels. So that's important, especially in Earth's early atmosphere. And plus, I wish I had the ability to kind of make a snack whenever I wanted. Plants are also cool because they have the ability to transport water and minerals up potentially hundreds of feet into the air against gravity. And animals, including humans, would not exist without plants. So humans, we use plants every day. You might be wearing some right now if you're wearing anything that's made of cotton or linen. You may be sitting on something wooden. You may be writing on some paper. And don't forget about things like fuel, building materials, medicines, dyes, and foods, even waxes. Many of those are derived from plants or plant-based compounds. So with that kind of little plant detour, I want to get into what is paleobotany. So paleobotany, as it says here, is the study of fossil plants. And I want to throw in a little caveat here that this presentation is from my perspective, and that does not encompass the entire field of paleobotany. Paleobotanists have different areas of research focus, whether they study different time periods or different plant organs. They ask different questions or take different approaches in their research. So there's many different subdisciplines of paleobotany that I won't be touching on in this presentation. So plants have a very long fossil record, and organisms that have relied on photosynthesis were present on Earth as far back as about 3.5 billion years ago. And the majority of plants that have lived on Earth are extinct today. But around 430 million years ago, there was a transition where land plants evolved. It was a bit of an evolutionary jump to go from living in an aquatic environment to living on land. Plants had to figure out how to support themselves. They had to figure out how to anchor themselves to the ground. They had to figure out how to take in and transport water. You're no longer living in water. How to keep themselves from drying out, figure out how to exchange gases with the atmosphere, and also different ways to reproduce on land than in water. So it wasn't that land wasn't available. It was available. It was more that there was a delay in colonization of the land because there was not enough oxygen on Earth. It basically took millions of years to accumulate enough oxygen for things to be able to transition onto Earth. And part of this was building up the protective ozone shield to protect these plants and animals from excessive UV radiation. Water provides some more protection to UV radiation than just living in water. And I see a question. Yes, there was no land plants about 430 million years ago. So when we look at the fossil record, we have early on in the, around 430 million years and kind of those early land plants, we find cuticle fragments, which is the waxy layer that covers many plants to keep them from drying out. We also find some spores, and we find some some of the early land plants were about 18 centimeters tall, and we're still talking around 400 million years ago. So these plants looked very different from the plants of today. And fossil plants can also be used to study past climates and used to reconstruct past ecosystems, which are two areas that I find particularly fascinating. But I also want to mention what paleobotanists, including Molly, the main character in the book, are not. So first off, they are not archaeologists. This is a common point of confusion and misconception. So archaeologists study past human activities and cultures, including examining artifacts. And sometimes they intersect and collaborate with anthropologists, including paleoanthropologists, that study humans, human behavior, and societies, both today and in the past. So that may include looking at fossils of ancient hominids, which are ancient humans. That goes to about 6 to 8 million years ago, is kind of on the old end of the spectrum. But that's a much shorter record than what paleobotanists and paleontologists study in general. So more than 400 million years of life on land and even older in marine environments. So the other thing is paleobotanists generally are not dinosaur experts. I can tell you with confidence that many 5-year-olds could outfact me with dinosaurs very quickly. Sometimes you consult with vertebrate paleontologists to provide the environmental context of what plants were there, what was growing, what might those dinosaurs, or I should say non-avian dinosaurs, because birds are living dinosaurs, what they may have ate, the environment that they lived in. But a lot of us really, I saw a documentary about a cool dinosaur fossil, and I'm going to be like, great, and I'm going to know the same amount as you. But generally, paleontologists are focused on studying animals and plants from the past, including the evidence that they left behind. These are called trace fossils. Things like burrows and footprints fall into that category. And I just want to mention the photo in the top right. Even when it's hot, many of us wear long pants and long sleeves. This provides good sun protection, also protection from sharp rocks, dust, scorpions. Had an encounter with one of those. Yes, I really am covered in dirt with this picture. It's a hazard of the trade. You put on sunscreen, the wind blows, and it sticks to your face. So, all right. So with that, I want to transition to a little bit more about details about the field of paleobotany. Don't worry, I won't do a full semester's worth here. So what can fossilize? In short, pretty much everything, but some plant organs are much more likely to fossilize. So here's a list of some plant parts, and I'm going to start with phytoliths. So these are microscopic structures made of silica that are found in all living plant lineages, but go back in the fossil record to the late Devonian, so over 350 million years ago. And they function in structural support and defense against herbivores. It'd be like taking a bite of a plant and getting little tiny shards of glass. So that can deter some herbivores from consuming these plants. Pollen and spores also preserve easily due to their small size and resistant wall that allows them to persist through geologic time and survive the attack of acids that's required to extract them from the rock. Leaves tend to preserve really well in plains of sediment because they're flat. So that's a relatively common plant fossil. And wood fossils preserve in different conditions than a lot of these others. We find them more often in association with bones. Or if there are vertebrate fossils, sometimes the only plant fossil we'll find is the wood fossils. And then the flowers, fruits, and seeds tend to be a lot rarer. But when we do find them, they provide a lot of information towards a successful ID of the fossil, and I'll talk about that coming up. But in general, we only tend to find a small piece of the entire plant. So like I said, leaves are common plant fossils, but most modern species are diagnosed using reproductive characters. So this can make confident identifications challenging. Even if you have a beautifully preserved leaf, you can still hit a lot of roadblocks in identifying it. And also I want to mention that since fossil plants are almost never found whole and their organs are disarticulated, so things like the leaves, the fruits, those are considered organs, and something like wood is a tissue. Each part is usually given its own name. And if we later find the organs and attachment, then the older name takes priority. All right, so you may be wondering how we identify these fossils, and there's some, this is alluded to in the book if you've read the novel, but in general, it's relatively tricky. Many fossils represent extinct or new species, while others can be more easily recognized. Generally, younger fossils are easier to identify compared to the modern flora than older fossils. So in this process, we are looking for distinguishing characters and asking if those characters are diagnostic of a certain plant order or certain plant family, or maybe even down to the genus level. And so we'll try and get some ideas of what our fossil might be related to, and then we're going to go out and compare it to previously identified fossil and modern material. So look at the literature to look at fossils. And here on this slide is some examples of modern material. On the top right, these are cleared leaves. These have been chemically cleared to highlight the veination in the leaves, which makes them easier to compare to the fossils. And then on the lower right, this is a sheet from an herbarium. Herbaria are basically libraries of dried pressed plants that we can use to reference. And they also sometimes have like collections of seeds or collections of wood that can be used for comparison, both to identify modern material, but also really useful for paleobotanists. So with that, I want to transition into pulling in some paleobotany themed quotes from the book and putting them into context of the field. So this is Molly. She was at the Phillips 66 fossil quarry at the bottom of the pit, chiseling away at the grayish rock. So you can see in this photo, this is a fossil quarry that I have worked on, and grayish rock kind of fit in well. And you can see those darker areas on the rock, kind of in the back corner of the screen. Those are pieces of fossil leaves. That would be the discard pile back there. But this is a quarry that's quite productive. And generally, unless we're doing a census type study or collection, which is where we're collecting everything, we usually cannot take every fossil back to the museum or back to the lab. Often there is not enough space, and fossils are also expensive and heavy to transport. So we focus on things that are new or rare or very well preserved. Sometimes in the field, we'll do a census survey where we'll take record data on every specimen as we find it, even though we're not able to collect all of them. So that's kind of a compromise that we sometimes do. All right, another quote from the book. It was frequently enough a challenge for paleobotanists to situate fossils in the record, and new taxa were identified all the time. But the quantity of mystifying fossils made the Phillips 66 unique. And so this was really fun for me, and I think we'll talk about this more in the discussion, but there are sites where we find a lot of unusual fossils, or ones that you kind of see them and you're like, wow, this is awesome. I have no idea what it is. And so this can take a lot of time to figure out. So the fossil on the right, I published as a new species back in 2015. This is an extinct species of Datepalm. Phoenix is the modern genus for Datepalm, which today is native to Africa and Southeast Asia, but it had a broader distribution in the past, including in the Rocky Mountain region of North America. And date palms today grow in relatively frost-free climates. So having some of this information also gives clues to what the climate may have been at this fossil site in the past. And the flower on the left is one that I'm still actively working on describing and identifying. Hopefully I'll get that published sooner rather than later. But this is another thing that kind of came out of the ground, and it kind of had the same reaction. Wow, this is awesome, but I don't know what this is. So moving into the lab, Molly found Quarry in the lab using a dental pick to unveil a Maginatea leaf. So Maginatea is a extinct genus in the Platanaceae or sycamore family. And this is what is shown here as Maginatea wyomingensis, which is one of the many species in this extinct genus. And for preparing things in the lab, many different tools can be used to prepare or uncover fossils. So things like dental picks, pin vices, razor blades, air scribes. It all depends on the type of material that you're working with, whether the rock is very hard, very soft, and the preference of the person doing the work. This process is called degaging, and it can take a few minutes to an hour or even days for very large or challenging fossils. There are people employed as professional preparators. They tend to work more on vertebrate and invertebrate fossils, but they will work on important or valuable plant fossils. And so this includes some of the massive palm fronds, if you've ever seen them, that come out of the Green River Formation in Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. And so sometimes you'll see them as wall art or in a natural history museum, those big palm fronds. And the last quote I want to share with you, yet eventually the familiar process, the pattern of shovel, chisel, hammer, razor blade, soothed her, absorbed her, as it had for all these years. The earth offered up 8 broken specimens, leaf varieties of which they already had many excellent intact examples. And this is such an accurate statement. How many times I can tell you sit out there and it's always exciting to find a new fossil, but it's more exciting to find something new or really well preserved. And so these images are ones that I just pulled out to show you kind of a typical kind of broken fossil, those ones that you see kind of highlighted in books and in museums. Usually those are the best of the best, but we still get a lot of valuable information from these fragmentary pieces. And if it's something that's more unusual, we take those fragmentary pieces back to the museum. If it's something very common, like the climbing fern on the lower left, we tend to leave them in the field because we just have so many of them. So with that, I want to leave you with my home in the field, which in this case is a windblown tent. And so there'll be some time for questions later, and we'll get into some more paleobotany content as we go.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm glad I got it right with the feeling of sort of carefully picking away and not finding anything that's terribly exciting, even though you're always enjoying the rhythm of it. So a direct link to our initial conversation, Sarah, you kind of touched on in those slides. But when I think back to our initial phone conversation where I had no idea that Molly would be a paleobotanist or how paleobotany would fit in the book, you said something that led me to such a light bulb moment. And it really was a light bulb moment that I had the second you said it. And what you said, and this is not a direct quote because it was from my notes that I was frenetically typing as you were speaking, but it's kind of it's basically a pull quote from what you said. You said, one thing that's interesting when you're looking at fossils, even when you have a great fossil that's well preserved, it still might not match anything in our modern flora. So this idea that I think that there's something, as someone who was pretty ignorant about paleobotany, as I think probably many of us are, I just thought it was a field where probably a lot had settled into place. Like, this stuff is old and you figured it out and it's probably fairly settled. And speaking to you and realizing what a dynamic field it is and how much we don't know and how you are constantly discovering new things, that it's not some dusty old thing, but it's actually very exciting. That was a real revelation for me. And the idea that you could find things that were mystifying to you, that you didn't have an easy answer for. So what that led me to in terms of Molly was I knew that I wanted her to be finding things at the site that didn't make sense to her. And so when I realized that in our real world, paleobotanists find things that don't make sense to them, I realized that this was the perfect job for her. So in the book, the reason that she's finding things that don't make sense, the reason she's finding both fossils and artifacts that don't make sense, there is a supernatural reason for that. I'll put it that way. There is a supernatural reason that is the one speculative element of the book. But aside from that one speculative element, it was very important to me that the book had a real feeling of realism in terms of everything else. So the fact that I was able to find a job that has an inherent sense of mystery to it and use that as Molly's job at a time when she's confronting a lot of mysteries in her life and in her work, it was just this perfect marriage and really enabled the plot to fall into place for me.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And, there are sites where we find things and we don't know. And obviously the long-term goal is always to figure out what they are. But sometimes they sit in a museum for a very long time before that happens. And also the field really is dynamic. I mean, there's always more rocks to turn over. And sometimes we make discoveries in the field and sometimes we make discoveries in museum drawers. So it is a really dynamic field. There's going to be projects to work on for, I would say, millions of years, just like there's millions of years of rocks to look at in the past.
So I know you gave one example in the slideshow of a fossil that you've named, right? You were the one who identified and named the windmillis, which is a charming name. And how many fossils have you named? You're a relatively young person and you've already named fossils. When you told me that you had named fossils, I thought that only, a handful of people got to name fossils, but can you speak a little bit about the fossils that you discovered and named?
Sure. So I think I've named around 5 things right now. Some of them were in a single paper, but if you find a new species and you are diagnosing and describing that species, there's a process and a code of rules that you have to follow. It has to be, for example, validly and effectively published. So you can't put it in a newspaper. It has to be in a scientific journal, for example. But if you find it and do the work to describe it, your name gets associated with that as the person who named it, and that's called the authority. And so things that were named, modern plants that were named hundreds of years ago, Linnaeus was the authority on many of those. But we have people to this day naming modern plants. There's still a ton of modern plants that are still being described, but I would say potentially even more so in the fossil record. And there's new fossil plants published all the time. So if you really get into the literature, they're out there.
Again, I feel foolish now, but my assumption of it being just a solid set of facts that we knew, it was so exciting for me in the research process. And this is something I love about being a novelist and having to do research, is I gained a whole new understanding of what this field is and how really dynamic and exciting it is. And Sarah, you brought that to life for me. And I think that all of you got a taste of it with the slideshow, that Sarah takes these things and makes them understandable to the layperson.
Yeah, it's definitely a very dynamic and changing field. It's not boring, I promise you. There's always something new to discover, and there's many different directions. And as I alluded to, there's many different facets of paleobotany, and kind of my little niche of paleobotany is different than someone else's niche of paleobotany. But like I said, I don't think any of us are going to run out of projects. We may run out of funding, but we're not going to run out of projects anytime soon. So
another thing that tied into the book that I find very compelling about the fossils is that if you discover a new fossil that, say, indicates that the climate was different from what you thought it was in that area at that time, that opens up the possibility for a different history than the history we assumed. So you can make discoveries that shift your understanding or that gesture towards an alternate version of reality from the reality that we assume is true. And there's a real tie into the book there in terms of different possibilities. So that was another element of paleobotany, the idea that that fossils gesture towards alternate realities that we aren't aware of.
Yeah, no, and that's true. And a lot of that is more information or maybe there was no fossils there before and we were using other information. There's different ways to estimate past climates, not just fossil plants. They're kind of one of many tools. So ideally you put a bunch of tools at them, or even different methods within paleobotany to get information about past climates. But it is one of, in my paleobotany biased opinion, better ways to get information about past climates in terrestrial ecosystems. So we have to be on land for them to be valid.
And I believe you said in one of our conversations that some of the things that you can ascertain about the climate could prove useful in terms of climate change now, or informative in terms of what life on Earth can look like in different climates.
For sure. So, I mean, in the past, there's been huge swings in temperature and carbon dioxide levels. And so we know that plants have evolved and survived these transitions. What is different is that the time scale that it happened in the past, even if it was geologically fast, we're still talking tens of thousands of years. We're not talking a couple decades to 100 years like we're seeing now with the modern record. So what's alarming now is the rate at which kind of global temperatures are increasing, and the concern of plants are not really going to be able to adapt or migrate to deal with that at the speed that they need to. So it's really a rate differential between the fossil record and geologic time and these human or anthropological influences now.
Okay, well, on that sobering note, let's see. I guess I'll ask you one more question, Sarah, or I'll recap one more question I had for you early on, and then maybe we can move to questions from the audience. But I asked you, what is an unsolved mystery, or what are some unsolved mysteries in paleobotany that are really interesting or exciting to you? So do you have a favorite unsolved paleobotanical mystery?
Sure. Well, there are many. So there's definitely some in my own research right now that I would love to solve to get those projects moving. But kind of on a bigger scale, the origin and diversification of the angiosperms, which is the flowering plants, would be really interesting to dive into and understand a little bit more. So today, angiosperms are the dominant plants. There are about 300,000 species, and estimates for that go up and down. But they really didn't come on the scene. So we have pollen grains from maybe about 132 million years ago. And we have macrofossils, so like leaves, about 125 million years ago. But I told you land plants, we have evidence around 430 million years ago. So there's this huge gap of time where we have plants growing on land, but until relatively recently, kind of end of dinosaur era, was when we got this kind of appearance of the group of plants that is dominant today and in nearly every ecosystem on Earth. So Darwin actually called this an abominable mystery. Something that he didn't really understand. He wrote that in a letter to a botany friend. And he was really kind of wondering how they diversified and arose so quickly. And so there's been a lot of hypotheses. We found some really great fossils to try and get to the root of this question, but we don't know where on Earth angiosperms might have originated. Did they originate as woody things, as herbaceous things, in kind of as a highlight environment, a shady area, a wet area? We really don't know. We really don't know what the closest ancestor is. There's a lot of great science happening in this area. There's a lot of hypotheses, some of them that are very convincing, but there's no kind of definitive one answer. And so that's an area of active research, I would say, and it's something that I also find very interesting because, you know, Darwin brought it up in the 1800s, and here we are 2020, and we're still kind of grappling with the solution.
Thank you so much. Let's see, I see we have some questions. Let's see. Let's see. There's so many good questions. Someone has a question. Can you recommend sites near New York City where one can look for fossils?
Okay, so
I like that one.
I would say a little bit about that. So first off, you always want to check the local, state, and federal laws to see if you are allowed to collect fossils in the area that you're going. If it's private land, you usually need permission of the landowner. But if it's public land, you may potentially need some sort of permit. So you definitely want to look up the rules. In terms of fossils near New York City, most of the bedrock underneath New York City is pretty old and is not likely to have plant fossils. In the surrounding areas, there's definitely some there. Most of the sediments there are kind of early land plant ages, so kind of things that would look very different from modern plants. Off the top of my head, I cannot name any specific sites that I can direct you to, but you may try looking in some of the books like Roadside Geology of New York and see if there's any suggestions in there. And often there's a lot of local fossil clubs that if you get in touch with them, they would maybe be able to bring you to a site, and they would also know the rules of the area and whether you're able to collect without any issues. So I would try and connect with a local fossil club as well.
Great. We have a couple more good fossil ones. Maybe I'll answer this one from Mike and Bev. In general, what is your level of commitment to factual accuracy in your novels? And I mean, it's a mix. I write fiction that often takes place in a slightly alternate version of reality. So that gives me some leeway, both in terms of my imagination and in terms of factual accuracy. But as I said, in the case of The Need, there's a lot of reality bending that goes on with what the fossils are, and there is a speculative or sci-fi element to the book. But in terms of the day in, day out, what it's like to work at a fossil quarry, what are some leaves that they realistically could be looking at, I wanted to talk to Sarah about all of these things and get her take on it as someone who had been in that position. So that accuracy was important to me, because I feel like if you're going to ask people to take some imaginative leap into a speculative world, you almost have more of a responsibility to make the reality of it even more textured and more accurate. It is a novel after all, yes. So I would say it's a mix, but I did have Sarah, I asked her to read the book and be on the lookout for any paleobotanical errors. And you caught a few small things that, you know, a lot of people wouldn't have noticed, but it was really important to me that I think at one point I said something about the color of the rocks, and maybe that was the wrong thing, and we decided grayish was more accurate. So I took a lot of pleasure in trying to get it. Any mistakes in the book that are paleobotanical in nature, I take full responsibility, but I did take a lot of pleasure in trying to really get that right. And for the book I'm working on now, I'm doing a lot of research about artificial intelligence. So I'm in correspondence with a professor of computer science. And I love doing the research. I feel like it's one of the great privileges of being a novelist, that you get to ask someone an insane number of questions about their professional life and get them talking about what they're excited about, that you might not have an excuse otherwise to grill them so much on these things. Sarah, you have one. How do you decide what to name a new fossil? I love this question from Allison.
Sure. So this is, there's a lot of different approaches for this. So I see in the question, it could be something descriptive. So it could be a specific feature of the fossil, a certain morphological feature, so something about the shape or the characteristics. You can also name it after the location that you found it. So it could be the specific site, it could be the state. I'm working on something now, and the species name is Coloradensis, so originally found in Colorado. You do have to be careful as we get, you cannot have, in the plant kingdom, you can't have anything with two names that are the same. And so there are a specific set of rules that you have to follow, but most commonly are features about the fossil or features about the plant. The location, they can be named after people, but there are some other rules for that. It's very bad taste to, for example, name it after yourself. So there are some guidelines and rules, and there's a very long code called the International Code of Botanical Nomenclature. It also includes fungi and algae, where you can find all those rules. And it's also a good option if you're experiencing lots of insomnia. So.
Great. Yeah, we talked a lot about how fossils are named in our discussions. And another thing that's interesting in terms of naming is I named the fossil site in it the Phillips 66 because it's near a gas station. And I wasn't sure if that was a good name for it or if I needed to give it. I asked Sarah, how do you name these sites? And she said, there's actually one called the Red Hot Truck Stop locality because it's near a red hot truck stop. So I figured the Phillips 66 was okay, but I love that quirkiness of the naming that's possible. We're getting so many good questions. I don't even know how to begin. Let's see. Let's see. Esther asked, can you discuss the role of creativity in your respective fields? It may be more obvious for a novelist, but can Sarah also address the role of creativity in science in general and paleobotany specifically? I love that question.
Do you want to start, Helen, or?
Well, I mean, in terms of this book and in terms of paleobotany, there were a lot of, by doing research about it, I got a lot of ideas that I never would have gotten otherwise. So I feel like a lot of times for me, creativity, there's an exciting moment in creativity where you take something from the outside world or you learn something and you go through an alchemy where you turn it into something that gives you an image or gives you a scene that enriches it in a way that you never could have arrived at on your own. So again, I'm in the beginning stages of a new book. So I'm really in that stage where looking outward, asking questions is a way to bring it inward and use my imagination, sort of giving my imagination fodder to work with. But I'm curious what your answer would be, Sarah, because it's certainly a different process.
For sure. So I guess I never really thought of my field as creative, but in a lot of ways it is, because sometimes I describe it as a treasure hunt, and it's a treasure hunt in more than one way. It's treasure hunt and actually going out and finding what you're going to study, whether that's in the field or in a museum. But then it's a treasure hunt to figure out what it is. And that's kind of where the creative part comes into play. You really have to keep an open mind and look at these characters. And I've seen a lot of beautiful kind of, as you get into this, I go on walks around my neighborhood and I just kind of appreciate the beauty that plants can create. And I wouldn't appreciate that until I kind of really honed in on looking at those features in the fossils. But I guess my main thing would be just keeping an open mind. And it's very non-traditional in terms of science, where a lot of science disciplines, you kind of set up an experiment and you kind of march through the experiment. And here, I think we're a little bit more non-traditional in that we kind of sometimes work backwards. We have a final product and then we have to go fill in all the gaps of what is this thing? What can it tell us? What does it tell us about the environment? So you're kind of missing all those pieces, even though you have this final product. And so it's almost like you have the book without the words in it or something like that. So.
I was going to bring up the question from Amy Ewan, that her image of fossil hunting, she writes, my perception of the fossil hunting field is similar to Sarah's pictures out in the wild, far from civilization. In the book, Molly's home is close to the quarry where she digs. Are there paleobotany quarries in more urban or populated areas? And then a follow-up, where is the most impressive or impactful place you've searched for fossils? But I wanted to illuminate that question because some of the stuff you said about finding fossils when they're building buildings and they just have to build the buildings over the fossils was really disturbing and alarming to me. So maybe you could touch a little bit on how ubiquitous they are. And I remember, Sarah, you said something like, think of how many leaves there are on the planet right now and how many there have been historically compared to how many animals there are. So of course, we live on a planet that in many places is covered with leaves. And so there are fossils everywhere, right? I mean, depending on the soil, I guess, but.
Right. So some sediments are more likely to preserve fossils and then long-term be found later. But there are some fossil quarries that are in civilized areas. I have dug next to a school. Sometimes it'll be like near a commercial shopping center. Ideally, if it's something that is not already known about before, if they're found in the process of construction, they'll notify a local museum or someone else that can alert the scientific community, and they'll bring people out to try and get some material before it's covered up or destroyed. Sometimes pieces of a site are still accessible even with the development, but not always. A big project recently was the expansion of the Panama Canal, and there was a huge paleontology team that went down there a couple seasons to collect as they did more exposures while they're expanding the Panama Canal. But now those exposures are not accessible after the construction has been completed. So there's definitely some sites. I mean, if you have the right kind of rock, it doesn't matter if it's in your backyard. I know fossil sites that are in people's backyards or in more urban areas. A lot of times you're just not likely to know them, or they're unfortunately paved or built over. And I want to just mention briefly the impressive or impactful place you've searched for fossils. So every place I've looked for fossils is usually beautiful, but the one that made the kind of beauty statement for me the biggest was I was down in the northern Peruvian Andes 2 summers ago, and it was a 5,000 foot drop down to a river below, and that was definitely top of the list for most beautiful places look for fossils.
And most terrifying?
It wasn't like a sheer
fall down.
But, okay. Yeah, you definitely didn't want to roll all the way to the bottom. That would have been bad.
I see we have some more great questions, but Melanie, I think you wanted us to cut it off at an hour. So is that?
Why don't you take one more question?
Take one more question. Okay. So I will. Brian has a really hard question. I'll read it and then I'll see if I can answer it. Brian writes, "Thank you and Sarah for doing this. I love that this book tied together so many tones and feelings. Specifically, I was interested in how you wrote fear, both everyday fears, but also a deeper fear one might feel towards sublime, incomprehensible things like alternate realities and weird out-of-place objects. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach writing about these things? Do you have a concrete process, or do you just let your instincts guide you?" Yes, it is. There is a lot of fear in the book. Both kind of the everyday nature of, like, I dropped the light bulb and now there's shattered glass all over the floor and I have 2 tiny children, just that kind of everyday anxiety. And then the anxiety of the fact that we're on a planet that's just kind of hurling through the void and we have to find a way to make meaning in that circumstance. I don't feel like I have a process for writing that. I feel like the themes of my books are basically whatever I'm freaking out about or anxious about at a particular moment. So I keep a running list of the things that make me anxious, such as the fact that Sarah told us that though there are precedents for climate change on Earth, it hasn't been on this short of a time scale. So when I'm in the process of planning or thinking about a book, I'll just write down little moments of anxiety or moments of existential anxiety that just pass through my head. And there's something about writing them down and putting them on paper that I don't know if it lessens them, but it gives them a place to live. And so, yeah, I guess it's mainly instinct, but it is, you have indeed gotten at the heart of things. I feel like in this book, I was writing about what some of my greatest fears were at the time that I was writing it. So, okay, I guess, should we wrap it up there, I guess? Thanks to all of you who asked questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. Kevin, I don't know if I'll write for young readers again, but maybe I will. We'll see how things happen. I always like to do the opposite, different thing from what I've just done. So we shall see.
Well, thank you both so much. That was so fascinating. It was such a great conversation. I learned so much. I'm really grateful to you both for all the work that you did to prepare for everything, and thanks to our audience too. And make sure you use this link right there to pre-order the paperback of The Need if you don't already have a copy of the hardcover. All right.
Great.
Well, thank you so much. This was really enjoyable for me to participate, and I think both of us.
Yeah. Thank you. It was such a quiet collaboration, and it's really, really fun to share it. Our conversations were one of the highlights of the book writing process for me. So thank you once again, Sarah, in front of everyone.
Thanks, Helen. I appreciate that.
All right.
Thank you, Melanie.
Good night.